Look at this map. According to a shocking new geopolitical theory, this is the end game. 5 regions. That is all that remains of Ukraine. Everything else, gone. For years, the West told the world, as long as it takes. But overnight, the story has changed. A single decision. A single ultimatum. And suddenly, Europe is forced to answer the question nobody wanted to say out loud. What happens when the United States simply walks away? Because according to the explosive claims spreading through political media, the new administration in Washington has delivered an order that doesn't just tweak the strategy of the Ukraine war, it flips the entire chessboard. The narrative is blunt. America stops military support. Fully. Immediately. No more artillery shells. No more financial tranches. No more intelligence backstops. And, in the same breath, the alleged endgame appears. It is a map that looks nothing like the borders recognized in 1991. In this scenario, Russia keeps what it holds and more. Ukraine is left with a reduced core, stripped of its industrial heartland. If these reports are true, this isn't just a policy adjustment. It is a geopolitical earthquake that will trigger aftershocks for decades. So why would Washington cut off Kyiv now, after years of aid, after countless speeches, after billions of dollars invested in the promise of victory? The answer in this narrative is complex, but it starts with a scandal. It starts with money disappearing. It starts with weapons aid, turned into a pipeline for corruption. A scandal so ugly it allegedly shook Washington's establishment and gave the new leadership the perfect justification to pull the plug. But the corruption story is only the surface. The deeper reason is colder, sharper, and more terrifying. Because ultimately, this decision isn't about right or wrong. It's about math. And the math says Ukraine is running out of time. Tonight, we are going to break down the timeline that led to this moment, the alleged scandal that fueled the decision, and the chilling intelligence reports about a Russian shadow army that explains why Europe is in a state of panic. It starts with a deal that Washington allegedly put on the table months ago. The proposal was simple, brutal, and pragmatic. Freeze the front lines exactly where they are. Recognize that Russia controls the territory it has taken. Stop the bleeding. Begin negotiations. In diplomatic terms, the message was clear. Accept reality before reality becomes worse. But the claim is that Kyiv refused, completely, categorically. The Ukrainian leadership's position has been consistent for over 1,000 days. No land to Russia, no recognition of occupation, no surrender in slow motion. And that refusal is where the alleged chain reaction begins. Because in this story, Washington looks at Kyiv's answer and decides, if you won't accept a negotiated stop now, then do not expect the American taxpayer to bankroll a war. You cannot win on the battlefield. That is the moment the ultimatum enters the narrative. The alleged message is no longer a suggestion. It is a threat. U.S. military aid ends. If you have followed this war from the start, you understand why this would hit Kyiv like a nuclear bomb. For years, the Ukrainian defense effort has depended almost entirely on the flow of Western support. And at the center of that pipeline is the United States. We aren't just talking about cash. We are talking about the nervous system of modern warfare, satellite intelligence, real-time targeting data, logistics chains, maintenance for advanced systems like Patriots and Bradleys. Take that away, and the entire balance shifts. The Army doesn't just lose weapons, it loses its eyes and ears. But why would the U.S. abandon a partner so abruptly? In the narrative circulating now, the justification is framed as a mix of moral outrage and political convenience. Corruption. The allegation is that American auditors and intelligence services finally looked closer at where the aid was actually going, and they discovered what they didn't want to admit publicly. We are talking about funds meant for military procurement ending up in offshore private accounts. We are talking about humanitarian aid, food, medicine, generators, being diverted and sold on black markets while soldiers on the front lines went without. We are talking about fuel intended for tanks and trucks being siphoned off in bulk. There are even reports of ghost battalions, units that exist only on paper so that commanders can pocket the salaries of soldiers who are effectively non-existent. Whether every single detail of these allegations is proven in court doesn't matter. In the world of high-stakes politics, perception is reality. And in America, nothing kills public support faster than the belief that taxpayer money is being stolen by a corrupt machine halfway across the world. You can argue strategy all day. You can debate borders. You can deliver speeches about freedom and democracy. But the moment voters believe they are being played, support collapses. And that, in this narrative, is exactly what the new administration is using. They position the cutoff not as a betrayal, but as common sense. Why fund a government that rejects peace terms and cannot account for the cash? However, if you look deeper, you realize corruption is just the excuse. The real driver is the battlefield. This brings us to the second argument, the one that turns this from a scandal into a cold-blooded strategy. American military analysts have been watching the front lines, and they see a grim trajectory. Ukraine's reserves are depleted. The average age of the soldier is rising. Equipment is worn out after years of high-intensity combat. And, critically, ammunition is being burned faster than the entire Western alliance can manufacture it. Meanwhile, Russian mobilization continues. The Russian military-industrial complex has fully pivoted to a war footing, churning out shells and drones at a rate Europe cannot match. In that picture, the calculation in Washington is brutally simple. If Russia is going to take more territory eventually anyway, then why keep paying for a slow defeat? Why pour more weapons into a war that isn't reversing? Why delay the inevitable if delaying only increases the body count and drains Western budgets? This is the line that makes Europe panic, because Europe's entire stance has been built on the idea that the West must not reward force with territory. European leaders repeated the same promise for years: defeat Russia on the battlefield. No negotiations on Moscow's terms. No land for peace. And then, suddenly, the biggest pillar of that coalition, the United States, steps back. In this story, Brussels is left staring at a terrifying reality. Europe cannot replace America. It is physically impossible. European weapons stockpiles are dangerously low. Production is too slow. Budgets are squeezed by energy costs and domestic inflation, and the public mood across the continent has shifted. Voters in Berlin, Paris, and Rome are seeing higher prices. They see their industries struggling with expensive energy. They see their taxes flowing into a war that feels endless, and they are asking the question politicians hate. For what? What is the end game? The narrative argues that these questions are now shaping policy more than speeches about values. And that brings us to the most dramatic, specifically detailed part of the story: the alleged peace terms. The leaks claimed that if the U.S. forces a settlement, Russia gets exactly what it demanded from the start: recognition of control over the occupied regions, and guarantees that Ukraine remains neutral, permanently outside of NATO. And then comes the line designed to hit like a hammer, the specific detail that illustrates the scale of the loss. Ukraine keeps 5 regions. Everything else falls under Russian control or becomes a demilitarized buffer territory. Let's look at what that actually means. 5 regions implies a rump state. It means the loss of the industrial East. It potentially means the loss of critical access to the sea. For Ukraine, that would be a national catastrophe, an economic amputation. For the West, it would be a humiliation not seen since the fall of Kabul, but on a much larger strategic scale. For Russia, it would be the ultimate proof that endurance beats money, that the West has a short attention span, while Russia has history. The narrative insists that this is exactly how Moscow designed the war: to last long enough for Western unity to crack, to grind down Ukraine's capacity, to wait out election cycles. And in this narrative, that moment has arrived. But here is where the story takes an even darker turn, because the intelligence reports don't just argue that Ukraine is weakening. They argue that Russia is holding something back, a force kept in reserve, waiting for the moment when negotiations fail. This is the detail that keeps military planners awake at night. The claim is that Russia has accumulated a reserve of more than 100,000 trained, equipped soldiers. We are not talking about the mobilized conscripts thrown into the meat grinder in the early days. We are talking about a reconstituted force, prepared, rested, armed with the lessons learned from 2 years of fighting. And the reports say they are not on the front lines yet. They are sitting just behind the contact line, waiting for the political chaos to peak. If such a reserve is real, and if it is used in a concentrated offensive, the implication is terrifying. The front wouldn't shift by meters or kilometers as we have seen in the grinding positional warfare of the last year. It could shift by entire regions. This is the hammer. The second shocking detail is what that reserve signals: readiness for a decisive final push if Kyiv refuses the deal again. In this narrative, Russia is not holding those forces for defense. It is holding them as a tool of coercion. Because if talks fail, the next offensive would be designed to break the Ukrainian armed forces completely, to shatter the cohesion of the defense before Europe can reorganize and before any aid pipeline can restart. And here is the heart of the American urgency in this story. The new administration does not want to be the one presiding over a total collapse. They don't want to keep funding a war that ends in disaster on live television. So they push for a settlement now, while there is still a Ukrainian army left to negotiate. This is the cold logic the narrative presents. Better a controlled freeze today than an uncontrolled collapse tomorrow. Better a ceasefire now than a forced retreat to the Dnieper River later. Better a humiliating deal than a total rout. And that's the trap. From Kyiv's perspective, accepting such terms feels like suicide. It rewards the aggressor. It abandons millions of citizens to occupation. From Europe's perspective, accepting such terms destroys the international order. It tells every dictator with an army that borders can be redrawn by force if you just wait long enough. But from Washington's perspective, at least in this narrative, refusing the terms means paying for a war that has no clean victory on the horizon. So the alleged ultimatum becomes simple: sign now or lose more later. And Europe, according to these reports, is caught in an impossible position. Publicly, leaders condemn the idea of abandoning Ukraine. They promise new aid packages. They talk about ironclad solidarity. But behind the scenes, the narrative suggests something else is happening: quiet recalculation. Because continuing total confrontation with Russia without the United States is not just difficult. It is suicidal for European defense. If the U.S. pulls out its air defense assets, its logistics, and its nuclear umbrella, Europe stands naked. And this is where the story stops being about Ukraine and becomes about the future of the world. Because if America can walk away from a conflict this central, a war it described as the defense of democracy itself, then every country watching learns the same lesson. Taiwan is watching. South Korea is watching. The Gulf states are watching. The lesson is, American support has limits. And when those limits are reached, policy changes fast. This doesn't only reshape Ukraine's battlefield, it reshapes global confidence. It tells allies to reevaluate their security guarantees. It tells rivals to test American endurance. It tells every capital on earth that time, slow, relentless time, can defeat even the largest military budgets. And in this narrative, Russia's strategy proves exactly that. The West bet on sanctions, isolation, and high-tech funding. Russia bet on endurance, mobilization, and raw industrial mass. And the transcript claims the West blinked first. Whether you agree with that conclusion or not, The implication is enormous. If the West cannot impose its preferred outcome here, on the borders of Europe, then the era of unquestioned Western dominance looks weaker than it has in 80 years. That's why this story matters. Not because it's dramatic, not because it's controversial, but because it forces the world to face the ultimate question of geopolitics. When reality becomes too expensive, who pays the price? If the U.S. truly pulls the plug, Ukraine faces a brutal fork in the road: accept negotiations under extreme duress, or fight on alone while the support that kept the front alive begins to fade into history. And Europe faces its own fork: either step into America's role, which it likely cannot do, or accept that the power to shape the outcome has shifted to Moscow. And Russia, in this narrative, sits in the strongest position of all, because time is on its side. Every month that passes, Ukraine's resources shrink. Every month, Western fatigue grows. Every month, that reserve army of 100,000 men waits for the order to move. So here's the final question, the one that will define the next chapter of history. If the choice is between an unfair peace and a devastating defeat, what would you choose? And if the choice is between your principles and your survival, which one wins when the pressure becomes unbearable? Because the most dangerous part of this story isn't what is said in press conferences. It's what might already be happening quietly, behind closed doors, where maps are redrawn, promises are broken, and the future is decided without microphones. If that is where this war is heading, then the next headlines won't be about another aid package or another speech. They'll be about a new border, a new balance of power, and a world that has just learned again that power is not only weapons. Power is patience. Power is endurance. Power is time. Now tell me in the comments, is cutting off support a betrayal of the West's values, or a cold calculation to save what is left? Can Europe really carry this burden alone? And if the world order is shifting, what comes next?